Welcome to episode 12 of the Most Important Skill in Life podcast. I am your host, Travis Daigle. Remember that the most important skill in life is personal ownership. This is taking responsibility for our actions, our beliefs, and our overall direction in life. And remember, when I talk about actions, beliefs, and direction, that's associated with the three principles that I went over in the first four episodes of the podcast. And a lot of what I spend time in, or a lot of the principle that I tend to spend a lot of time in, is the second principle, where we talk about story. And story really is our beliefs and assumptions about life tied together, or really, how do I say this? It's facts tied together through assumptions. And when I say assumptions, I'm talking about our beliefs and our overall philosophy and thoughts and ideas that we have about life, how we interpret the world. So we have factual information that we gather from life, but then we tie them together through assumptions. So I spend a lot of time talking about like our mindset. That's where our story exists. And I'm going to go into that more today in this episode. But again, most important skill in life is personal ownership. This is taking responsibility for our actions, beliefs, and overall direction in life. And I do believe personal ownership is a skill. It's something that we can identify whether or not we're doing it, and then we can practice it to greater levels as we move forward. So to get into today's podcast, let me start off with the article that today's podcast comes from. We are not prisoners to our past. And I published this on my blog, on my website, travisdaigle.com, on August 19th, August 9th, 2024. Again, we are not prisoners to our past. And just to prep the audience here, I am going to be talking about physical and sexual abuse from my past. And so if this is, if you want to, adjust your audio because kids are around, or if you want to, just prep yourself going into it, I do encourage you to listen, because we can't avoid the things that have happened to us, / we can't avoid the things that have happened to other people in our lives. So I think it's very important to be willing to talk about these topics that can be very triggering. So approach with caution, but also approach with courage. So here's the article. For the first time in my life, I'm going to see a counselor to discuss the physically and sexually abusive relationship I had with my older sister when I was younger. Over the past 10 years, I've had people recommend I see a counselor, but I never felt the need to follow through on that advice. Not that you must have need in order to see a counselor, but as I've said before, I've been able to overcome so much of my past on my own. I was just continuing on that road. That is self-improvement. A constant process of getting better, but sometimes we need help. Remember, I was a single man for a really long time before I got married, 14 years to be exact. I dated here and there, but nothing substantial ever materialized in that time period. I've been married almost 2 years now, and we've been living together for 3 years. There are things my wife observes in my behavior and beliefs that are being reflected back to me, things I've never seen before. For instance, my wife has been telling me for several years now that I often wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air. Honestly, I assumed this was related to dietary struggles I've been having for the last 5 years or so. I've gained a little weight, and I thought maybe I was having some sleep apnea. Well, I've cleaned up my diet fairly significantly, and I've lost some weight over the past few months, but I'm still waking up panicked. Furthermore, my wife says that sometimes I wake up, my eyes are open, I'm in a panic and reaching for things. This gives me pause because I have zero recollection of these things when I wake up in the morning. She says I do this almost every other night. She's been trying to get me to go to counseling for a while, and I'm finally taking that step. And just as a side note from the article here, my wife assumed that this was PTSD from going to Afghanistan. So just as a little bit of a side note there. To carry on with the article, what could it be? Maybe it is sleep apnea, but that doesn't make sense anymore. I'm not an overweight guy and I'm in good physical shape. Maybe it's night terrors. One of the things my older sister used to do to me when she was angry is she would sit on me and cover my face until I couldn't breathe and was flailing trying to free myself. Sometimes she would hog tie and gag me, then leave me on the floor in a closet. Obviously, I'd be terrified. I wonder if the panics I have at night are subconscious memories of those events. How long have I been doing this? My wife says since we started dating. That's over 4 years ago, and it's actually almost 5 years ago now. Who knows how long ago it actually started? Again, she's been suggesting counseling for a while. There's something about being a male victim of a female perpetrator of abuse that I couldn't connect with for a long time. There's something in me that says, you're a man, she was a female, it's not a big deal, get over it, it's history. This is further complicated by being a man who has done the things I've done. Being a Green Beret, going to combat, jumping out of airplanes, and doing an MMA fight. For a long time, I've struggled to connect emotionally with the 3 to 7 year old version of myself. But these nighttime episodes combined with some other challenges that have come up have me thinking more about my infant, toddler, and young child self. Small and incapable of defending myself. I see little kids all the time where I work, and I've been imagining someone 9 years older than them holding them down and holding a pillow over their face, hog tying them, sitting on their chest and stomach until they can't expand their lungs, or forcing them to perform sexual acts. It's terrifying to realize that my sister could have easily taken my life by accident on many occasions when I was younger. My current theory on the nighttime episodes is that faint memories of abuse are buried in my subconscious and they're starting to come up. I also think that my experience with my sister and to a lesser extent with my mother is a huge reason for some of the other struggles I've always had. I hate having a boss and I hate people telling me what to do. I grew up afraid of the two main women in my life, and as an adult, admittedly, I have difficulty accepting a woman in a supervisory role over me at work. I hide it well because I recognize it's unreasonable, but it's there. I'm also recognizing where I still struggle with self-advocacy and holding in my real thoughts about various situations. This pattern of muzzling myself and hiding my real thoughts is something I learned growing up with my sister and my mother. It was exacerbated by being bullied at school. My concern growing up was always to not upset or frustrate others because it might lead to some sort of punishment or penalty for myself. I'm now recognizing how normal and unconscious it is for me to self-censor in my communication. Once again, I find myself at the bottom of a mountain staring straight up and taking in deep breaths as I prepare to climb. It feels sudden, and it's not the mountain I was looking to climb, but nevertheless, it's what's in front of me. I've got to deal with these issues if I want my relationships and my ability to communicate to be in a healthier place. I think one of the biggest challenges we face in life is taking responsibility for problems that deeply impact us that we did not create. It's these moments where bitterness and blame can settle in so deep, particularly when the perpetrators of the wrong aren't alive anymore. My sister took her own life back in 2008. This is why personal ownership as a skill is so important. The ability to see clearly and accurately through the fog of our legitimate emotions is predicated on our ability to recognize that we are responsible for ourselves, no one else. Yes, there's probably so much wrong that happens to each and every one of us in this lifetime. In my experience, it's the worst wrongs that we will never receive an apology or recompense for. But I will not be a prisoner to my experiences, and I will not allow you to be a prisoner to yours. Again, folks, the title of the article is "We Are Not Prisoners to Our Past." I published that to my blog on August 9th, 2024. So to expound more on the article, I want to start off. The first point I want to talk a little bit more about is, again, I say in the article, there have been times, I write it in my book, that I got physically and sexually abused. But if you read my book, I don't even go into as much detail as I do in this short article. I don't mention, I mention sexual and physical abuse, but I don't go into any of the specific details of it. I don't mention the hog tying or the being sat on. My sister used to, she would hold, things over my face, but I think probably even worse is when I was little, she would sit on me. So she'd like sit on my chest or sit on my like upper abdomen to where like I couldn't expand my lungs, and like slowly like I would run out of air. And I'd be flailing around, trying to get her off of me so I could get air. And so I don't know that these, I'm guessing night terrors is what I'm having. And I don't know that these episodes are in a reenactment of that actual experience or just, but I also have learned that with night terrors, that's like the common symptom, is this kind of waking up, gasping for air. And so I could just be having the common symptom, or I could literally be reliving that in my subconscious. I don't know. But I didn't go into a lot of detail in the book because I guess at the time I didn't feel it was pertinent to the book. And a lot of these experiences, I do foresee a second book coming at some point that has to do with how our body responds to trauma. And I probably will go into more detail in that book. At least I'm hoping to in the future. But, I never sought help before because I legitimately felt like, again, like I said in the article, like I'd gotten so far on my own. But the thing about being married, the thing about being single for so long, and the thing about now being married after being single for so long, is there's just things about yourself you don't see until you have somebody living with you who can be more objective. As much as I practiced self-awareness before, as much as I have always worked on self-improvement and have been such a huge advocate for self-improvement, there's just things, that I was unaware of. And certainly like my behavior during sleep was one of them. And it just gave me so much. The thing that prompted me to go seek out counseling was when my wife told me that I would wake up with my eyes open, reaching for things. Because I was just like, man, I have zero recollection of these things when I wake up in the morning. My wife will be like, yeah, like I was trying to calm you down and tell you it was okay and to go back to sleep. And like I said, she thought it was from PTSD from Afghanistan. And I remember for a long time, she just told me I would wake up gasping for air. But when she told me specifically, eyes open, reaching for things, what that made me do was think about what happened between my sister and I when I was growing up. And she kept saying Afghanistan, Afghanistan. And I was like, no, I don't think this is Afghanistan. Because like I've said before, I didn't go through some like crazy year-long deployment where I was fighting every other day, et cetera, et cetera. We got one major gunfight while I was there. That's it for a year-long deployment. There are many people who weren't Green Berets, who were like not even combat MOSs, that probably got into gunfights every other day. So I don't feel as though I have any PTSD from war, but I knew like I probably when my wife started mentioning these details of my sleep patterns, I was like, I probably do have PTSD from my childhood. But also, like for a long time, I ignored it because, like I said, I thought maybe it was sleep apnea because the last 5 years, I've struggled with eating and how I eat and eating too much sugar, et cetera, for various reasons that I think either I'll go into in future episodes, or I've gone into in past blog posts if you look through my blog posts. But I have gotten so far on my own. I mean, to go from I still think about it. I mean, I've said it a million times, but to go from this very easily intimidated kid to being a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, to deploying to combat, doing an MMA fight, participating in martial arts, losing all that weight, doing CrossFit, doing all these hard things. I've felt for many years as an adult, like, man, like I'm doing pretty good. I've got room to grow, but I'm continuing to evolve. But the whole night terrors and no recollection in the morning, like I needed help. Like, and I needed help understanding what that was. And just a couple of conversations with my counselor to be able to talk explicitly about what happened. I think that was super powerful. That's something that I've never done with anybody before. I've talked to my wife about specific things that happened, but to be able to like get in the room with a third party and really like lay out the details of some of those incidents that happened, but between my sister and I mean, that was so helpful. And I think part of it might be I never sought help again because I'd gotten so far on my own. I felt like, being a very high functioning individual, it wasn't that I thought that I didn't need any help or couldn't get any use out of it. But, like counseling is expensive. But another thing I didn't realize is that until recently, until the last few years, is that as a veteran, certainly here in Little Rock where I live, I get counseling for free. There's veteran services that offer counseling for free here. I don't know that it's like that in every like VA system across the country, but here it is. And it might have been like that up in Tacoma, Washington too. I don't know because I never sought it out up there. But yeah, just getting to talk to my counselor has been and lay out details. I think there's something about laying out the details that has really helped reorient my relationship to those memories and those experiences. And it's been transformative in a lot of ways. And look, in at the same time that I've gone through counseling and been re-exploring my childhood and these things that have happened. Because again, I wrote my book, Adapt and Overcome: 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life. I wrote my book and I didn't really go into detail about what happened to me as a kid between my sister and I, because I guess I felt like, you can imagine what happened or whatever. But I've realized in the last couple of years, even more so than when I wrote this book, I realized just how deeply those traumatic experiences have impacted me, not only psychologically, but impacted my physical body. And so a big reason I want my second book to like be themed around like the body and like exercise in relationship to stress and the difficult things that we experience in life is because, like, again, I've said it a million times. I've been doing work with Knees Over Toes guy for the last 3-4 years, not with him directly, but like following his programs. And here in the last year or so, I've been using the Gymnastic Bodies program by Coach Christopher Sommer. And a big part of both of those programs is a lot of stretching and flexibility, specifically around the hips. And my hips and low back have opened up so much. And I feel like it's no coincidence that that's also happening that opening around my hips is also happening when I'm kind of exploring emotional and mental depths that I've never explored before around trauma and around abuse when I was a little kid. Because I do think the abuse I suffered and the trauma I suffered as a little kid is a part of why my hips have been so tight for so many years, and why I've had back problems before, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a later book coming where I detail these things more and talk through more about like what my experience has been overcoming trauma in my mind and emotions, but also in my physical body. And because I think that would be helpful for a lot of people. But the main point here in this first part about seeking out help and seeking counseling is taking ownership is also about recognizing your limitations and recognizing where you have problems. It's kind of like if you had a little kid, not a little kid, but like if you had a kid in high school struggling with math, but they never said anything about it. And so they were just failing. You'd ask them, well, why didn't you, the teacher, the parents would ask them, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you say that you were struggling? And taking responsibility, part of taking responsibility is recognizing when you have inadequacy or when your knowledge has a gap and raising your hand and seeking out help. Now, not everybody's going to be able to seek out counseling because counseling is expensive. I, as a veteran, get it for free, and that's a super huge blessing for me. But I think also, there's the power of, and you have to be careful with this because not everybody can handle topics like abuse and sexual abuse and trauma and physical abuse, etc. Like not everybody can handle talking about these things, but if you can find someone who is, willing to listen and willing to discuss hard topics like that, maybe it's not a professional counselor, but maybe you can't financially access a professional counselor, but maybe you have somebody in your personal life who you can open up to about these things. I just think it's super important. It's super important that people discuss these things, and taking ownership means asking for help when you recognize that, your skills and abilities are inadequate in and of yourself to solve this problem. And that's what I recognize. Like, man, I don't know anything about night terrors. Like, I read a book recently called The Body Keeps the Score. And that book talks a lot about trauma and how it shows up in the body. And so that's been hugely helpful. And I kind of was reading that book in conjunction with when I first started going to counseling. And so I'm going to the counselor, but I'm also educating myself at the same time. Remember, you can always educate yourself. Like you can always start reading up on things, hearing the experiences of other people, and kind of trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle. And, like I said, I think I said this before, but like I had back problems. I started having back problems when I was probably 17 years old, right before I got out of high school. And it looked like, what I would call throwing my back out just randomly at different times, it seemed like. And it hasn't been until the last 3 years that I began to figure out that I started to see a trend in other people's stories where if they had significant childhood trauma, they seem to have this same pattern of throwing their backs out. And so I started to put the pieces together. And so you gotta, taking ownership, again, a big part of like story is recognizing where you have gaps, where you're making assumptions. For years, I thought I was having back trouble because I grew up overweight. Same thing with knee pain. Like for years, I thought all this was just a result of being overweight. But there were these gaps in my understanding. And then as I read and learned things about anatomy and physiology, and as I read and learned things about mental and emotional health, I started to be able to fill in some of the pieces of the puzzle. And so I would just encourage people out there, man, like if you can get counseling, get it. If you have a a trusted confidant in your life who you can talk about traumatic experiences with, I think do so. And if the least you can do is begin to research, try to understand what's happening with you. Again, The Body Keeps the Score is a great book, I think, and something probably everybody should read to help you understand trauma and how it affects the brain and the body. My second point, and it piggybacks on the first point about seeking help, is, I wrote in the post about being a male victim. And I think the other reason why I didn't describe in detail in the book some of the things that happened to me growing up is just because I think just by the time I wrote the book, I had done an MMA fight. I had obviously been in the middle, because it was 2021, I think, when I published it on Amazon. MMA fight, Green Beret Army, combat vet, like done all these tough, hard things. And so I think in a lot of ways, it was just hard for me to connect with my child self and the vulnerability of being, 5 years old, 4 years old, etc. And I think there's something in this about, especially like I said, with female perpetrator, my older sister, like there was a part of me that really did feel like, man, it's not a big deal. Get over it. Like, it's the past. It's over with. You're big. You're strong. You've done all these big, strong things. You're fine. And I think that mentality is a lot of the reason. Also, I think that I didn't seek out help before, because I just kind of assumed that it wasn't that impactful on my life, which kind of sounds ridiculous to say now. But the assumption I'm going to make, that I think I'm probably pretty right about, is that there are probably males and females, but specifically there are probably a lot of men out there who have some significant childhood trauma that they need to talk to somebody about, but because they're older now and it's the past, it's kind of like the past is the past. And they wouldn't even call it ignoring it. They would just say the past is the past, right? Like, they would just say, like, no, I know it happened, but we don't need to talk about that. It's over with. And I think the problem with that goes back to episode 11 of the podcast. In the last episode, I talked a lot about being honest about your actual condition so you can actually solve problems. I talked about, when I was younger, I was very honest with myself about I was overweight and I was slow and very unathletic. And I was honest about that assessment of myself because I wanted to be athletic. I wanted to be competitive in athletics. And so the first step to solving that problem of how do I go from unathletic to athletic is just acknowledging my actual physical condition. And I think the same thing applies here for men. Is like, for me, part of getting better right now is just acknowledging that these really rough things happened to me when I was really little and really vulnerable, and being able to put myself in the mindset of, hey, you got to imagine yourself not as a Green Beret, not as an MMA fighter, but as a little kid, 4 or 5 years old, who can't defend himself, who isn't big, who isn't strong. And you got to imagine like somebody bigger, stronger, older, imposing themselves on that smaller version of myself. I think a lot of men don't understand that you can't just wipe it away. You can't just walk away from it. You can't just say it's the past, it's done, and think you are unaffected. Like that, like it's simply not true. And so if you're a man out there and you've gone through physical abuse, sexual abuse, or some other kind of abuse growing up, something significant, and if you find yourself saying to yourself, but it's the past, I've gone past it. Okay, fair enough, but you aren't going to be lesser for examining it, journaling about it, talking about it with your spouse, your significant other, and thinking through, okay, how has this affected my present day self? Because this is the big thing that I'm taking away from counseling, is like the ways in which those experiences affected who I am today and my behavior today, and kind of revealed to me behaviors that I didn't even realize were there. I've known for a long time that I sort of had a problem with female leadership over me. But it wasn't until I started going to counseling that I finally put two and two together. Oh, wait a minute. Like, sort of the most significant females in my life at the time, my older sister and my mother, were extremely domineering, and in my sister's case, physically, sexually aggressive towards me, and subordinating me a lot. And so, of course, I have, challenges with females, and having and like I said in the article, I've always been good at masking that because I recognize that there's a problem there. Like, why do I have? It doesn't make sense that I have problems with female leadership. Well, now it does make sense. And so it gives me even more power over that urge or that instinct to take issue when I have a female that's in a supervisory role over me. And so, what am I saying there? By talking about the issue, I'm able to overcome the problem. By talking about the issue honestly and addressing what happened to me when I was growing up, I'm able to accurately solve a problem in my psychology that'll help me move forward in my career life or in other parts of my life. Like, if I'm having tense conversations with my wife or tense conversations with my mother now, my mother is older now. And it's interesting because, and me and my mother have talked extensively about, my childhood, what happened between me and my sister. And, we've talked about her behavior as a parent and, how she could be very aggressive and domineering at times and how that impacted me. And I often find myself, I've become more aware of when I'm dealing with my mother, when I'm being triggered and those patterns are coming out in me and I'm sort of lashing out at her, not because of the current situation, but because I'm being triggered about something about our relationship from the past. And because I've been going to counseling, I'm more aware of those patterns in myself. And that's just not how I want to be to my mother. And, now that she's older, she's in her 70s, I still firmly believe that she was just doing the best she could. She was a single mom and she was struggling financially and she was struggling with a lot of things, as I've said many times before. And so, being an adult, I understand, the struggle of trying to pay bills and deal with the emotional fallout of relationships that didn't work out, et cetera, et cetera. And to be able to have some empathy towards my mother, I'm able to exercise that empathy muscle a lot stronger when I understand the patterns of my behavior and where they come from. And that's come from going to counseling, really digging into the details of what happened to me when I was growing up, particularly between me and my sister. And so I would just encourage a lot of men out there, like, if you've got these significant experiences or traumatic experiences in your past, you need to find a way to preferably talk to someone. But if you can't do that, at least be willing to journal or audio record to yourself, like say out loud what happened and really begin to think through and articulate how these things may have affected you down through the years. I think that's the important process, to acknowledge the incidents and then be able to think through how have these incidents impacted my daily behavior and my interactions with other people over time. And that leads into my last point for this podcast, which is taking responsibility for something you didn't create. And this is huge, man. Like, this is huge for everybody. I think one of the places where bitterness and resentment settles in so deep for individuals in our society is when we experience the fallout of when we experience the negative fallout from situations and actions taken that were not our own and that we didn't perpetrate, right? So in the article, I talk about, my sister has passed away now. Like, she took her own life back in 2008 while I was in the Army, and so we'll never be able to discuss in detail why she was behaving the way she did and what was going on in her mind, or even the full extent of the behavior. How long did it go on? Like, how often did it happen, et cetera, et cetera. There are gaps there that I'll never know about. And another thing that I write about in my book is just, you know, so much of the deepest pains caused to me in my lifetime were the bullying that I experienced in school growing up. I'm never gonna get an apology from any of those people. That's never coming. And so often the biggest traumas, I say often, in my experience, it is often the biggest traumas that we experience in our life that we will never receive an apology for. And I think it's so important that if you don't want to be a bitter, resentful person, you have to learn how to take ownership of who you are and your behavior, be able to acknowledge the difficult, crappy things that have happened to you in your past, acknowledge the patterns of behavior that you've developed out of those things, particularly the negative patterns of behavior. Take responsibility for those things and adjust them. Don't use the fact that somebody did something to you to justify your own poor behavior. That's the point. Taking ownership and self-improvement is about being able to say, and really character development is about being able to say, this really difficult thing happened to me, but I will not use that as a reason to perpetuate those kinds of behaviors or any sort of negative behavior out of that, Yeah, I mean, it's the romantic relationship where you get cheated on, and it's very tempting to now look at everybody, if you're the guy, you got cheated on by a female, and now every female is a terrible human being. It's I think a lot of I think a lot of the tensions are around race that we have right now are 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 a symptom of this, where people are frustrated about something that's going on or that's happened to them in their own personal lives, and maybe they see it along the fault lines of race. Maybe like a white police officer roughed me up during a traffic stop or something like that. And it's that desire to then believe that all police officers, all white people are racist. When in reality, this is an isolated thing that happened to you. And yeah, maybe there are other racist people. Maybe that police officer was racist. Maybe there are other racist people. But it's the same thing. It's the same thing with me though, right? Like, just like I have to remember that a woman being in a leadership role over me is not me being a 5-year-old around my sister and my mother and being subordinated aggressively around them. That all women aren't that, right? It's the same thing. You have to be able to put a box around your experiences and then pan out and evaluate people on an individual basis. I mean, are there patterns of abuse in society? Is there racism, sexism, ageism, any number of isms in society? Of course there are. And of course these things exist. But if you are going to have relationships, if you are going to interact with the world and not be bitter and resentful and not be given to extreme ideology as well, then you have to be careful about classifying whole groups of people based on your experiences with one or two people, right? I have these one or two women in my life who at that time were struggling, and then that struggle rolled down to me. So as a grown man, I have a choice. Either all women are bad, or I was in a particular situation at a particular time in a particular context. And I think maturity says be able to differentiate and be able to not be pulled into, extreme ideas of they always, or people like this always, where you're typecasting whole groups of people. And I think the start of that is the skill of personal ownership. Sometimes we got to take responsibility. Not sometimes, a lot of the times, maybe all the time, we have to sometimes take responsibility. All the time, sometimes we have to take responsibility for our own behavior all the time. It's our behavior. We have to control what we can control. That means we also have to control our thoughts and beliefs, and we have to scrutinize our thoughts and beliefs and say, is this true? Or am I creating a narrative out of a painful experience? A narrative that may be completely false, a narrative that typecast a whole group of people because I'm guarding my own pain and I don't want to be triggered and I don't want to experience that thing again. So I'm othering a group of people. You got to take responsibility, folks. Again, we are not prisoners to our past. Listen, y'all, you can follow me at Travis Daigle on both YouTube and Instagram. Remember, this is the most important skill in life podcast. The most important skill in life is personal ownership. That is taking responsibility for our actions, beliefs, overall direction in life. Make sure you go to the website, travisdaigle.com, and subscribe to get my blog posts when I publish them. I publish a couple every month right now. And you can also go check out my book, Adapt and Overcome, 3 Principles to Master the Most Important Skill in Life, Personal Ownership. It is available on Amazon. Listen, folks, if you're listening on Spotify, make sure you're following and, follow on all the other platforms. And I do appreciate you following. It helps. Like, subscribe, do all the, comment, do all the things that help me with the algorithm. And I will talk to you all next time.